Well, hello everyone. My name is Brennan Davis, and I am the Education Chair with ISM Dallas. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Risk-Based Decision Making for Supply Chains, hosted with Purple Ink and ISM Dallas. A quick note about some logistics, please make sure that you stay on mute, and we will have time at the end for some Q&A. Also note that this meeting is being recorded. With that, I will turn it over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Brennan, and thank you, ISM Dallas, for this great opportunity. I know this is a crazy time, but I'm happy to have this chance. And it's great to be able to speak to you all virtually. One good thing about the pandemic is it allows me and everyone else to meet with people all over the world without those long plane flights that I'm used to. So today I want to talk about risk-based thinking and risk-based decision making and how you can use these tools to improve your supply chain. I'm going to start with something a little bit. I think you're all familiar with Murphy. I have a nice Irish background and heritage. So Murphy's Law was always alive and well in my home and in my life. So you probably all heard of this in some version. There's longer versions and different things, but this is a pretty common one that says nothing is as easy as it looks. Everything takes longer than you expect. And if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong and at the worst possible moment. So I'm sure you've all had those situations, some probably this year because it's been kind of a crazy year since the February, March kind of timeframe, and we're still in the middle of all of this. The other one of Murphy's Law that I like is the odds of the bread falling peanut butter and jelly side down is directly linked to the cost of the carpet. So the more expensive the carpet, the more likely fall down with the gooey side right smack in the carpet. I haven't really seen. Here's another thing I want to share that we can probably relate to. So these are some examples of managerial thinking that aren't exactly risk-based, even though one is entitled Essentials of Risk Management. So the essentials of risk management just says, don't do anything wrong today, don't do anything wrong tomorrow, and then repeat that. So it'd be nice if we could live our lives like that, but that's not really risk management and that's not how we live our lives. The other one looks at of course, we considered the risk. That's why we spent so much time and analysis making sure we knew who to blame. So some companies operate like that, some people operate like that, but hopefully we're going to show you some more tools so you don't have to operate like that. And then the final cartoon there on the bottom, this is part of my corporate life, is we're pulling along this cart, and I'm sorry the resolution's not great, but they're pulling along a cart with square wheels, and it's full of rocks, and it looks really hard to pull, and a guy's offering them some round wheels, which would make it easier, and they say, no thanks, we're just too busy. So we, as employees and in the workforce today, supply chain professionals, we know that we are very, very busy. And if this resembles your workplace, then you're in a good place, because we're going to talk about actual risk-based thinking, what that is, and how to incorporate some of that. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I'd like for you to participate in the chat if you don't mind. So if you answer any one of these questions, yes, just put that number into the chat. So the first question is, do you know the 2 dimensions of risk, and do you incorporate them into all or most of your decisions? This can be personal or at work. I am talking about the workplace, but you can apply most of this to your personal life as well. So if the second question, does your organization track identified risk occurrences along with the rate of incidents and impacts? And then finally, are you confident on how to bring risk-based thinking into your organization? So for every question that you think is a yes, please put into the chat now the numbers 1, 2, and or 3. So we can kind of take a quick poll to see, do people really think they know about risk-based decisions and risk-based thinking? So I'll give you about 20 seconds to do that. Okay, I guess you guys don't want to participate this morning. That's okay. So we'll just move right along. There's some, maybe it's just a delayed chat. So looks like a lot of you don't have the answers to that, which is great. So we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about a VUCA environment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this acronym or not, but this is an acronym that's not exactly new, but it's getting a lot of notoriety. And we're going to talk about how we define risk. We're going to look at 5 different domains of decision making. And then we're going to look at 4 types of decision making that you can make. We're going to talk about 3 factors that can help you reduce these impacts. And then we're going to do a raffle and I'm going to give away some prizes. So stick around. Um, so we have a lot to cover. We're going to award some prizes and I want to make sure I do that. So I want to make sure I have time and everything. So, and I'm going to take questions at the end. So if you want to participate in the raffle, this is how we do it via Zoom. If I was there in person, I would say, please give me your business cards if you want to participate. Since we can't do that, I'm going to say, send me an email to jane@purplelink.co. There's no M. And just put in the subline webinar. But you got to stick around. You got to listen to the whole thing. So if you're here at the end, I will give you a chance to win that. And you can send me that email. If you're not quite ready to do that, I'll give you another chance before I make the drawing at the end. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. The reason I'm talking about risk today is because this is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's definitely in the climate and environment for supply chain professionals today. Many people and many organizations got a rude awakening in the March and April timeframe as they found gaps and challenges in their supply chain. And many of them they didn't even know were there. My background is in industrial engineering, and the first part of my career was as a manufacturing engineer, and I worked in aerospace. So I'm a bit of a factory geek. I really never turned down a factory tour, and you can ask my husband. He's been dragged through all kinds of places. Um, but I worked for a company for almost 10 years, and then they announced they're shutting down. So they were just shutting down that, moving the work out. It was done. So, as luck or fate would have it, I was finishing up my MBA at that time and within a couple months of the plant shutdown. So, I was looking for something different. I was open. I wasn't really looking, but when they said the plant shut down, I started. So, I looked around and the best job I found was from Hewlett Packard. It was a great company, but it was in procurement. And I knew nothing about procurement. I was an engineer, right? So that's what I had done. Um, but they needed somebody with manufacturing experience. They needed people who could lead projects, and I knew I was good at both of those. So even though it took me a year to admit that I worked in procurement, I eventually embraced it. I grew to love the travel, the opportunity to work with incredible people all over the world, and the ability to work with lots of different manufacturing processes. And one of the things that really that really came home to me was the relationship between risk and cost. So there I was in procurement trying to look for collaboration and win-win solutions with my suppliers. And that really amounted a lot to reducing the risk to be able to reduce the cost. So I had learned in my manufacturing experience on the factory floor as a manufacturing engineer that cost and risk were related. But in procurement, it really opened my eyes to a lot of different risks and a lot of different ways that those two items were related and how one drove the other. So I really wanted to do a good job for my company. I really wanted to do a good job for my career. So I worked on this and worked out some ways to address risk and manage risk and to be able to reduce cost. Now that's my passion. I founded my company to help clients prosper and include suppliers in finding these dollars that are leaking through the supply chain and draining everyone's bottom line. But it's not all experience and it's not all education. It's the combination of using concepts and applying these to the real world. So we're going to start by looking at some commonly encountered risks and look at the risk theories and philosophies that can be probably applied to your workplace. So these risk categories should be familiar. These are things that most companies deal with all the time. At the top, health and safety. Again, I'm a manufacturing engineer. Health and safety have always been paramount. I added the pandemic because now that's on everybody's mind. So when in a factory, rule number one is safety. You have to do all of the safety protocols and make sure everyone in the place is safe. And now we have to do that considering that we have a pandemic. We've always been concerned in supply chain with business continuity. So things like natural and unnatural disasters are always something that we're looking for. Many of you are in the Dallas, Texas area. That's not as close to Hurricane Alley as Houston is, but you know how that affects the state, how that affects the different areas. And this season has been a particularly tough one for hurricanes, and we're not finished yet. And then there are unnatural disasters. There are things that happen, fires, there's accidents, there's things that happen in a factory all the time. And you want to make sure that you minimize that risk and then definitely minimize the impact of that. We have labor practices. If you in the procurement area, ethics, labor practices, um, all of those things are very important. Customer right now, where everyone's looking at their suppliers' financials, the customer financials, and your own company's financials to make sure that you are health missed this pandemic. We're still always looking for key employees. We want to make sure that we're taking care of our employees, that our employees are able to develop so that we can attract, develop, and retain the good people that we need to move our businesses forward. We're looking at regulatory, legal compliance. All of that's always huge in any factory, and it's definitely big today because we have more and more compliance regulations all over. And these are not standard. They vary a lot from state to state, city to municipality, and then, of course, from country to country. So there's a lot of things that we're dealing with, and not one of the least by any stretch is the cybersecurity. So information, intellectual property, all of those things. Anytime you have suppliers involved, you have the confidential, proprietary, and intellectual property security that you're worried about. So this pandemic has sent shockwaves through the global supply chains. I'm in Southern California, and we know about earthquakes and shockwaves and aftershocks. So once you have these aftershocks that we're dealing with, and we're going to be dealing with those for some time, whether you think we're through the pandemic or we've turned the corner or we're waiting for the second wave, wherever, there's still going to be some shockwaves from that. We've got a lot of different things going on. So as we move into recovery, organizations are looking at their supply chains even more closely. They're looking to close the gaps that the pandemic exposed. They're looking to see what other risks might appear that that weren't uncovered by the pandemic, but could come back and bite them later. So as part of recovery, we're really looking into this and what is into the new normal. And that should include risk-based thinking. So I told you we're in a VUCA environment. Again, this is an acronym that really came about 1986 as part of the Army War College when they were trying to characterize the turbulence in strategic leadership positions within the Army and the other services. And they came up with this term. So it means that a situation is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So these are the four things that make up VUCA. So it's a lot of different things going on at one time. There's increasing change of technology, globalization in addition to the pandemic. There's a lot of competition. Demand has been all over the place in volatility, so we know about that. Uncertainty, we sure are in an uncertain time. Right now, we've got a lot of things we're dealing with. We're dealing with the pandemic, we're dealing with the elections. That's local elections, statewide elections, national elections. So we have a lot of things going on there that can potentially affect the trade. More tariffs, less tariffs. We've got a turbulent world with factions fighting and different things going on all over, as well as the trade issues. We're using technologies in new ways. We talk about big data, Internet of Things, blockchain. There's a lot of different things going on there. Our world is more complex than ever. We talk about the global world being smaller. So the world is smaller than ever. So it's more complex. We have interconnected industries, markets, geographies, and we're looking at how we can move and how we can flex and how we can be resilient with our supply chains to come back as quickly as possible. And then we have a lot of ambiguity. Karl von Clausewitz, who actually came up with this, he's a famed military theorist. He's the one that crafted the VUCA. Says he called it the fog of war. There's a lot of things we can't see. Right now, we have the fog of the pandemic. We're going to know a lot more when we're looking at this in the rearview mirror in a few months. But right now, we know what's happened the last 6 months, and we're projecting forward. And you see a lot of different projections of what that might look like. So we're still in this fog of the pandemic. And we've got a lot of people looking at this data, but just turn on the news and you can see that a lot of people come to different conclusions looking at the same information, the same data, and drawing different conclusions. So based on your own history, you have all of that bias that you bring in. And we see that everywhere in everything we're doing. So when we look at risk-based thinking and we look at risk-based decisions, one thing we need to look at first is what is our appetite or our ability to tolerate risk? We need to look at that as a personal item because some of us are risk takers. I like to snow ski and I'm not a risk taker, but I see people flying down the slopes on skis or on snowboards. I have a very small street that we live on. It's not very long, but I see people tearing down that on in their cars. I see kids on their skateboards, a lot of different things going on. You'll see this on the road with road rage and different things. You see a lot of people who are risk takers. Maybe they're mountain climbers. Maybe they push the envelope on a lot of things. They do triathlons. Other people are very risk averse. They follow the speed limits. They pay attention to the caution flags wherever they are. And when it's suggested that you do something, they comply. They get this. So we have these different ranges, a different continuum of risk appetite. Some companies have the same that the companies have the same continuum. Some companies, usually tech companies, are pretty risk tolerant because they have to be. They have to be more, they take on more risks because they're trying to be more bleeding edge, not even leading edge, but bleeding edge. Other companies are more bureaucratic, more traditional, more hierarchical, and more risk averse. They use proven processes. They want to make sure things work before they move forward very quickly. So it's important to understand where your appetite is and where your company's appetite is for this. Risk assessments need to be performed using these two dimensions that we'll cover in just a minute. And it's best to do those with cross-functional teams to evaluate risk from these different perspectives, both internally to the company and externally if you can possibly include that. That would be customers and your suppliers and maybe your third party providers that can give you another insight into what is working and what's not and what the risk is. Because you need support for these decisions that you're going to make ultimately, it's important to use a consensus process. So you all support the assessment of the risk and the assessment of the impact, and you all walk away supporting the decisions that you make based on that. So you don't have to have that as your first choice, but you have to have an understanding of how you came to that decision and then support for that decision. So these two dimensions that I talk about are probability or the likelihood of the occurrence of the risk, and the second axis is the consequence or the severity of the impact that's going to result from that. So I'll give you an example. I told you I lived in Southern California and we have earthquakes here. 100% certainty that an earthquake is going to happen in this Los Angeles area, say over the course of the next year. 100%. But that doesn't mean that we're all going to feel that earthquake the same. The closer you are to the fault line, the more that you feel that. And a lot of the earthquakes we experience here over the course of a year are very low on the Richter scale. And thanks to building codes and the businesses and homes have been enacting here for decades, most of these homes and businesses can withstand low and even moderate earthquakes. Many times they occur and residents here don't even know that. I come from the Midwest and it's not unusual for someone to text me or give me a call and say, "Are you okay?" And I say, "What?" Right now it's fires, but I'm not very close to the fires. I'm lucky that way. For this one, we had a very close call a couple years ago. but people call me when they hear earthquakes. My mother used to call me all the time. She's not with us anymore, but she would call and say, "Oh, I heard there was an earthquake in the Los Angeles area." So she actually visited here. She knew how big the Los Angeles area was, but many times she heard about something that I didn't hear about and didn't know. Now, so the probability of the occurrence is really high, but the impact here is negligible to minor damage usually. There is a chance that we're going to have a big one like we did in 1984 when we had that Northridge earthquake. And that was serious, that caused some serious damage. But most of our efforts here are channeled into handling the smaller impact, the smaller Richter scale earthquakes, because that's what we get most often. We do have business continuity plans, and companies talk about what happens if there is a large earthquake, but most effort is put into managing the smaller ones. That's the higher probability. And luckily for those, the impact is usually very negligible. So these maps can vary from organization to organization. They should meet your company's appetite for risk. If you've used these before, that's great. And if you haven't used these, then you can start very simply. If you look at the one in the middle, it's a 3 by 3 matrix, and you can see that 3 of the squares are red, 3 are yellow, and 3 are green. I apologize for those of you who are colorblind, but hopefully you can see the distinction in the color, whether you can tell if it's red or green. In this case, we're using a simple 3 by 3 matrix, low, medium, high. And we use the two scales again are the probability and the impact. So if it's low probability, low impact, it's in that lower left corner. If it's high probability, high impact, it's in that upper right corner. And I apologize because the words on those scales are pretty hard to see, but you can read the word medium, probably the easiest, and then the low and the high are the other sides of that. So you can start with a very simple scale. You can see that there's other models that I've included to include 5 by 5 matrix, a 4 by 4 matrix, and you can get very sophisticated with these with actually assigning values to them. You can use like QFD numbers where you go from a 1 to I think it's 1, 5, and 9. You can assign weights to those. You can do a lot of different things. And you can see that some of the 3 of the 4 examples there have in the upper right the danger area or the high risk, high probability. But in the lower left, it happens to be in the lower right part of the graph or the chart. So it doesn't matter what exactly it looks like as long as it meets your company's needs. You can also see that the patterns are different. In the 5 by 5 matrix, there's a smaller area of risk and consequence and likelihood. It's in that 2 by 2 square in the corner. The yellow is less, and the green is quite a bit of the area. So it goes a much wider range. Again, there's no right or wrong on this. It's really how your organization feels about the risk and what your tolerance level is and how you're evaluating these. The these evolve as your organization becomes more accustomed to using those, but consistency is really important. So these maps shouldn't vary from department to department, from project to project, or from 1 month to the next. They do evolve over time, but you want to start small, start simple, and you can increase the expertise, the complexity as your expertise with these models develops and as you are able to um, proliferate those throughout the organization. So that's a great model to start with, looking at the risk and the probability. Now we're going to talk about some dimensions in decision making. This is based on a Cynefin framework. So that is a Welsh word for habitat. It says, where are these risks lying? So similar to the fact that we're looking at the risk assessment, what's high probability, what's low probability, what's high impact, what's low impact. We're going to look at the severity and um, we're going to look at these dimensions. So the first one is simple and complicated, complex, chaotic, and into disorder. So these are going to get progressively more interesting as we look through those. So we'll walk through those one at a time. So I included this picture because it really kind of personifies or gives us a visual to say, this is how a lot of us are feeling. This is the framework for the Cynefin framework, but it is too detailed to put on a slide. It's really too much. You can't really read it, but it is how we all feel when we are dealing with all of this stuff. So you can see this is hard work that we need to do. When we look at the simple domain, decisions that fall into this are the familiar decisions. These are decisions we've made before and we're going to make again. We may have rules, we may have processes. We know how to proceed on these. They're not usually in highly volatile environments. And we have a clear path pretty quickly because, again, these are more familiar areas. We know what we know, the known knowns. There's a lot of rules that we have that we've developed, and we can handle these pretty quickly. These are things that you make decisions on all the time and don't even think too much about it. The danger in this area, if you think these are simple decisions, if they're not simple decisions, that you can downplay the risk or you don't have the risk fully understood by makers. If we correctly these risks are low probability and low impact, then we can have a lot of problems. So we want to try different things from time to time to see if we can get a better result. When we get into the complicated domain, this is where we have known unknowns. Organizations and individuals know there's questions and there's things that they don't know. And sometimes this can result in what we call analysis paralysis. So there's so many things we don't know that we don't want to make a decision, that we are so busy analyzing that we don't get that decision made. In this case, if you take too long to decide, you can miss the opportunity entirely. And if the dynamics change while you're trying to do your analysis and make your decision, you can make a wrong decision ultimately that's not going to give you the results you want. So if you have good leadership, you can drive to closure in a timely fashion in these instances, even though you don't have all the information and all the analysis you would like. And you need a little bit more of a risk tolerance. You need a willingness to make decisions without complete data so that you can get a timely, positive outcome. In the complex domain, we move into an area of unknown unknowns. So this gets a little more sketchy and a little more dangerous because we don't know what we don't know. So those are the things that can wreak havoc down the line. A lot of us were there when we first started talking about the pandemic because none of us have been through this pandemic in this way before. We see on television and on the news a few people who lived through the flu in 1918, but it's a much different world than that today. So, and those people are all over 100 years old. So it's pretty amazing. But there's a lot of things that we don't know. And that happened in the February, March, April timeframe. And there's still a lot that we don't know. So decisions in this area are best assessed after the risk is over and after the impact has happened. Unfortunately, that's the way to do that. Then we see what we've learned and we can see how well our mitigation strategies and prevention strategies worked. So in this case, when we have these situations, many teams want to dissect these risks. They want to dig into these, put these in smaller chunks, and they really want to take it apart and see how it works. But when you take it apart to see how it works and you can't figure it out then, and you can't tell how it works, then that's when you're in this complex domain. So what we learn is that sometimes the best path forward is analogous to putting a puzzle together that's got 1,000 pieces. You don't pull out a few pieces at a time. You dump the whole from the table, you put all the stuff out on the table, and then you start sorting into what you can do, what you know and what you don't know. And what you don't know, you can deal with at a later time, and you can try to make sure that you're looking for the trends, looking for the patterns, looking for the things that tell you what's working and what's not working, and then adjust as you go. So complex domain gets to be a lot more tough to make decisions. In the chaotic domain, you have a lot of the complex issues, but you're really dealing with quickly changing circumstances, or from a situation where you've identified a lot of symptoms, but you don't know the root cause. So this is an emergency without a playbook. This is a real triage situation. You're dealing with something that you haven't practiced in business continuity, something that you haven't identified before, and you're really trying to sort out what's critical from what's just hurt and bad and not in good shape, and where can I put my resources so they're actually going to make an impact. Because this is an area where you don't want to apply resources to a lost cause, because you're wasting the resources and you're not changing your outcome at all. So you really need leaders in this environment. You need leaders who can make decisions even with the uncertainty and the quickly changing circumstances. And you need people who can be there to help, because action in this case is going to be better than waiting to see what's next. The quicker you take action and the quicker you move in a direction, you're going to be better off. In these situations, communication and communication strategies are a huge help. If you haven't talked about who's going to do what, then you're going to be falling all over each other. I've done a lot of business continuity exercises as part of the supply chain department, and some of the communication is always, if it has to do with suppliers, it's got to go through Jane's organization. That we're the ones gonna talk to the suppliers, but we have to figure out who on my team is going to talk to which suppliers, so that we don't have three people calling one supplier and nobody calling six other suppliers. So you have to break that down, and you have to know who's going to communicate. You have to focus on what you're going to communicate. So those communication strategies really, really can help make or break those situations. And then you make your decisions, you break them down into small steps, and you build a foundation to get back on your feet. In the center is the disorder domain. This is another emergency or crisis situation, but it's really unclear when you're in this domain whether anything else is going to work or not. There's no clear way forward. There's no evidence to take you in one direction. And the people that are dealing with this can't even agree on what to do first. When you're in this, and hopefully you're not in this very often, the best thing to do here is to break down the situation, see if you can apply some other techniques, see if you can see ways that they lead to another, so that you have a little bit more framework of what to deal with. So you're looking for techniques and approaches that you can apply, and you really don't want to make sweeping long-term commitments. You're really doing this very incrementally, small decisions, and then course correcting as you see fit, because this is an area where it's complete disorder. So we've talked about the risk and the ability to break that down into the components of probability and impact. We looked at the different domains. Now I'm going to look at types of decisions that you can make. Once you understand about the risk, there's things that you can do to actually decide. The first of those is terminate. When we look at that, we say it's not worth the risk. So we're looking at risk, but we're always looking at what is the reward of that. The action that you're doing that might have the risk in it, or the project or the activity, has to have some reward. You have to be doing that for a reason. So in some cases, if it's not worth the risk, if the cost of the impact is too high, if the probability is too high, you don't want to go in that direction, then you have to terminate. Excuse me. So you want to look at what makes sense in a situation. Maybe a supplier is in breach and you've done a lot of things. There's no clear way forward. You've spent money with the supplier. They're not getting better. So it may be that it's time to just cut that off, declare the breach, terminate the contract, and go find another supplier as quickly as possible, so that you don't have a lot more pain. But there comes a point sometimes with suppliers where you're just pouring resources into it, and the situation's not getting better. Then you need to cut your losses and move. So there's a lot of different situations where you want to terminate, but you have to say that is an option. That is a type of decision that you can make. If the risk is identified with medium probability, medium impact, it's sometimes a good strategy to treat that condition, get ahead of that before the actual risk occurs. So you want to monitor this situation pretty regularly. You want to find ways to reduce the likelihood or the consequences, or even both if you can. You want to look for early indications, early warning signals so that you can react quickly and deploy your resources before the impact escalates to serious or critical condition. So in this case, when you have medium probability and impact, you're really looking for what's the first indication that it's happening so I can get ahead of it and not wait till it gets really severe. If the risk is one with medium or even high probability, but low impact, often the best course is just to tolerate the risk and proceed in spite of the risk. So you move forward, you've got your appetite for risk says, I can tolerate this. Then you want to monitor the situation, try to reduce the impact or the likelihood of that if you can. But if the reward is significantly greater than the risk, then you want to proceed and tolerate that risk. You don't want to ignore it. You've already identified it. So it's something that you can track and be aware of, but you're going to tolerate it and move forward in spite of the risk. And then another strategy where you have decisions is to either share or transfer the impact or the probability. Usually, this technique goes with medium and high impact risks, and mitigation or reduction of that impact can be expensive or would take a lot of resources or maybe just a lot of time to address. So, if you can bring in other stakeholders, either customers, suppliers, or another outside organization, or internal stakeholders to help, then you can transfer the responsibility, the impact, and you're going to be able to manage that in a way that not one single entity takes all of that, but it's dissipated amongst the stakeholders, and it's a better solution for everyone. So finally, we're going to take a look at these three factors. There's three factors that can really help you make sound risk-based decisions, or honestly, they can be one of your biggest obstacles. Any of these or lack thereof can be your best help or an obstacle. The first factor we're going to talk about is people. The people that participate in the risk assessment, people that help make the decisions, people that craft the mitigation plans and monitor the situations. We have people throughout our organizations that are involved with all kinds of risks and risk-based. So people are really a maker part process. We all have unique backgrounds and experience. We we all know that that shapes how we look at situations. We all, as I said before, have differing appetites for risk, and our functional perspective on the probability impact that affects the different functions in the organization and the different ways that we do things. Our views are shaped by our experiences, our training, and the outcomes that we've encountered from previous situations. Even if they're not very close, we're still impacted by that. And we've probably learned and been reminded in these last few months of the pandemic, of some of those instances. And now we have social unrest, we have political climates, and we all know that stress, especially from all of these things, is not a real positive influence on human beings and human behaviors, and isn't really something that adds to good decision making in any climate, even when you're not using risk-based thinking. So this is why we really encourage you to use consensus. This is the preferred approach to risk assessment and to risk decision making. Getting participants to discuss their ratings of the probability and the impacts, getting them to talk about their rationale, to share the data, the sources that drove them to rank those in that way, and to come to a mutual conclusion. It's not as necessarily that everyone agrees. It's not a compromise, but it's an understanding that everyone has of the situation, and every participant can support the rest of the organization because they understand those perspectives and they respect the conclusion of the team to do that. So you want to be really careful with the people that you include and the ways that you discuss and open up those discussions. The second factor to success is information. I've talked about states of decision making, and I've talked about terms like analysis paralysis, waiting too long to make a decision, taking too long, or jumping to conclusions. And those have situations, those have conclusions and results that may be not optimal. So with situations where we have known and unknown risks and unknown components, incomplete information, we still have to make decisions. Today, we have more data available than at any time in our history, but we can still have incomplete, insufficient, or even worse, incorrect information. Data and information are subject to interpretation, and they're subject to the analysis process that you use. So, depending on the source or the process that you use, you can come up with very different types of information using the same data. I'll give you a good example of this in supply chain. Procurement supply chain departments always have to track cost savings. Every company I worked for and every company I've worked with is tracking cost savings in some way, shape, or form. And often the department head is reporting on these savings, and usually they're significant savings. They report in terms of dollars, unit cost, or sometimes they do a percent reduction against a standard cost. That's how they report. But rarely have I seen a finance department report the same level of savings. Now they're looking at the same information, and there's a lot of reasons for this. When procurement counts cost reductions, they don't usually count cost increases. You're looking at reductions, not increases. And they don't associate the indirect costs that have to go into that as well. They usually look at unit cost reductions. So, and they also may apply that unit cost reduction to a theoretical volume or a projected volume. So when they look at a cost and they say we save $5 a part, we're going to make 1,000 of those. We're going to save $5,000. So they report it as a $5,000 savings. Finance doesn't report projections forward. They only project the history and the recent costs. So they don't show any savings at all, even though you may just have booked or reduced a price that's going to result in a $50,000 savings. So the timing of the reports isn't the same, even though they're looking at the same basic data. The differing methods they use to capture that data, to track it and report it, result in different conclusions and different assessments of the performance of the organization. I've seen finance departments get pretty hot and say they aren't doing anything. Our costs are going up, and yet the operations or supply chain department adamantly insists that they have saved 3%, 5%, whatever it is, of cost over the last year. So neither of these organizations is wrong, but they're not measuring the same things in the same way. So teams should assess risk using consistent numbers, information, and the same processes to whatever extent is possible. So that helps support a uniform and a consensus decision. The final factor of the process we use is the final factor is the processes that we use to assess, measure, rate, rank situations, and conditions. You can use the RACI model, which is a great one that talks about responsibility, accountability, consultancy, so including all the contributors, getting people involved, and then who has to know before and after the decision. So informing people of what the decision is and a lot of the why. So that's a great model for reference. But the maps for risk assessment that we looked at earlier, these need to have some consistency, and you need to use a standard process within your organization to apply for the risk-based thinking and make that risk-based decision-making part of the culture. So if you don't use if you use inconsistent processes or don't have everyone on the same page, you're not going to get very good results. So then your impacts are going to be more. So these three factors are very important. So what I know for sure is there's a better way to manage risk by using risk-based thinking and decision-making. COVID-19 has been a big kick in the teeth to a lot of people and a lot of organizations. But companies now are super attuned to how valuable managing the supply chain is to manage the bottom line. And for us as supply chain professionals, it's very important that we recognize this and step in, lean into this situation, because we do have a lot of information, experience, and ideas that can help companies move forward. So we know supply chains are critical to a business success. Many of my friends and colleagues, when I said I was going to start my company and do supply chain consulting, and when I tell people that's what I do when I meet them, they say, "What's supply chain?" I've had a lot of people come back to me and say, "Oh, supply chain. Now I get it. It's because you're the one that helps us or keeps us from getting the toilet paper back in March." So I say it's not exactly that, but they are becoming more aware. We know we need that end-to-end visibility of the supply chain. We know that decisions are impacting more than one company, more than one individual. These things go up and down the supply chain in different waves, in different speeds, in different levels of impact. Decision making is hard in any and every environment, and it's especially hard now when we have so much stress on us. We have so many different things that are up in the air, and we still have to keep ourselves moving and our companies moving. There are a lot of risk indicators, and we have to be aware of those, identify those, and look, pay attention. We need to make sure that we have flexibility, agility, and resiliency within our supply chains, and just acknowledge that we live in this VUCA world, and it's going to be increasing and expanding our risks. So now your organization. I've given you a few things you can take back to your place of business and see how that works. In person, I usually ask you for your thoughts about what I've shared, but it's really hard to do that via Zoom and with so many people on the line. So what I'm going to ask you is just to yourself, identify something that you can take away from this presentation. Either write it down, jot it down, put it in your brain and say, this is what I'm going to take back to my organization, because there are things that are fairly easy to apply from this. If you're like me, you go to these talks and you get inspired and you get excited and you latch on to at least one thing, and you want to get back to the office and you're anxious to get back there and actually start implementing. But once you get back there, the latest disruption, and you try to implement things, all of this can get into your way because the real world kind of creeps back. Even though a lot of us are working from home, and you just shift from one Zoom meeting maybe back to your computer without, or you shift from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. So I want you to think about your company and your support system and who is in your corner to assist you and your company implementing some or all of these techniques and processes in your workplace. If you can use some support to do that, I invite you to consider working with me. If you're impatient to get started, we can talk about this. You can schedule a call with me to explore working together further. This call is complimentary. I reserved a few numbers of slots for these for the next couple of weeks for people who might need more assistance implementing some of the concepts and ideas that we just talked about. And I know that this time of year, a lot of you are getting ready for 2021, and that's coming much quicker than I ever imagined possible. So if you need help now, now's a really good time to do that. In this call, I'll review your current situation. I'll walk you through my process for looking at identifying risks and opportunities, and we'll decide how to work together to help you reduce the impacts and the risks and associated costs with your organization. I take time to work with you personally because working together requires a mutual investment. It requires some trust, and I want us both to be confident that Purple Link is the right fit for you and your organization. It's easy to get this call. Just go to callwithjane.com. It's a great option for you. And if you're not sure of the first steps to do, then it's a great way to take a first step and move towards some risk-based decision making in your organization. If you're thinking that sounds good, I'll do that later, I'm going to give you an incentive to do it right now, before you go back to the piles of work on your desk and the crisis of the day that's waiting there to overtake you. If you schedule a call by the end of the day, you're going to get some gifts. You're going to get the slides from this presentation, and you'll get a subscription to my dynamic dialogue webinars. So this is a great incentive for you to do that. Isn't it always great to get free stuff? I like to do that. So if you want to learn more about that, go to callwithjane.com. Okay, Now I'm going to give prizes and I'll take a couple of questions. So if you didn't already send me an email with the webinar in the subject, then you need to do that in the next 30 seconds because you're going to get more information about webinars, workshops. And if you'd like a follow-up call with me and you don't want to do the call with Jane, just put follow-up in the subject along with webinar. I'm going to give you, again, about 30 seconds to do that, and then I'm going to give away 3 prizes. I'm going to give away the slides from today's presentation. I saw a question on that. Yes, everyone who participates in the drawing will get the prize. So if you have to participate in the drawing to get the slides, otherwise I don't know how to reach you. So if you haven't done that, make sure you send me the email and put webinar in there. And then I'm going to give to the lucky winner a book. I have this book, Measure What Matters by John Doerr. It's been recommended by Bill Gates and some other people. It includes his experience as a venture capitalist working with Google, and what he talks about are objectives and key results. So we know KPIs and we know objectives and goals, but he has a term he's coined for objectives and key results, OKRs. And you're going to get a subscription to my dynamic dialogue webinars. So that's a pretty exciting thing. Again, more free stuff. So I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds and I'm going to do my random number generator here and pick a winner. Let's see how many people. Very sophisticated way to do this. Ariana Stone, I think. If I mispronounced your name, I'm sorry, but Ariana. So if you're still on, maybe you can confirm that you're the winner. And then I need you to send me another email with your address so I can send you the book through the mail, since I can't do these in person and bring books with me anymore. So if you're there, Ariana?
Yep, great, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So now I'm going to open it up for questions. Maybe Mark, you can open up all the mics if there's any questions.
Well, this is Brennan, and I can start for a second. So one of the factors to success that you mentioned was information, right? And can you give some general useful tips for working with very limited information?
Yeah, very limited information usually comes from limited data. So if you don't have the data, then you can always interpolate, extrapolate. You want to be careful that you don't make assumptions, just pull things out of the air. Okay, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me now. So if you have to make assumptions, you want to document those assumptions. So if you come back 3 months, 6 months later and you say, why did we do that? Why didn't we have this? If you have these assumptions documented and you didn't mission. I don't know why I keep going on mute. But I think I'm unmuted again. So you want to be careful about that, but sometimes you just have to make decisions and you don't have all the information that you want, or as deep of information you want. Then you want to make shorter term decisions or put monitoring and checkpoints in place so that if you make the decision, you don't wait a year to go back and evaluate that. You want to look at that and say, okay, we're going to do this, and then we're going to check this in a month or in a quarter, or whatever time frame makes sense for that. I hope that helps, Brennan.
Yeah, thank you. Did we have any other questions for Jane?
Other questions?
You should be able to unmute yourselves by now.
Yeah, sorry about that. No other questions? Then I'll let you get back to your days. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for your time, Jane. Really appreciate this. We will have a recording that I'll send to you, Jane, and to the others that are relevant too. Thank you so much again.
Great. Thank you.